Welcome to Central Bank Central. I'm Kathleen Hays. Today, the Labor Department released a report that, get this, two reports, two jobs report in one, November and October. So I'm very happy to welcome back to Central Bank Central Ryan Sweet. He's Chief Global Economist and Managing Director at Oxford Economics. So let me give you a couple of numbers, which you know well. You've been going all over this report all morning long. The Labor Department showing a headline of 64,000 increase in payrolls in this combined October-November report, and the unemployment rate rising to 4.6%. It was at 4.4% in September. So, broadly speaking, what's your verdict on this report, Ryan?
Yeah, well, I think even though there was, several data points, depending on whether you're pessimistic or optimistic about the economy, my takeaway is that the job market seems to be finding its footing. And I think that is encouraging news as we're heading into 2026. That might sound, a little bit rosy given that the unemployment rate went up to 4.6. When you peel back the layers of the onion of why the unemployment rate increased over the last several months, a good chunk of it is because of new entrants into the labor force. And they're unfortunately, they're showing up as unemployed, but that's less threatening to real disposable income and by extension, consumer
Okay.
spending than if the unemployment rate was rising because of layoffs.
Okay. So we're going to go dig down in all these economic holes because there's so much in there, as you said, and it's unusual because the Labor Department doesn't usually have to do this unless there's been a government shutdown. So what is kind of the headline for this report that you think people say, and that means the Fed is what?
Well, I think the Fed is too data dependent. I mean, they're hinging their outlook for monetary policy over the next couple of meetings based on every single data point that comes in on the labor market and on inflation. I think they got to be a little bit forward looking. So I think in this report, the Fed's probably going to be zeroed in on the unemployment rate. I mean, they're concerned that it's rising, and typically the unemployment rate doesn't just go up in a linear fashion. It can, go up pretty quickly. And that's going to concern some of the dovish members of the FOMC that, the job market is showing signs of, maybe it's not stabilizing, maybe it's getting a little bit softer. But I think if you look ahead, we know there's a lot of noise in this number in the unemployment rate because with the government shutdown, some of these workers might have been misclassified. There's, seasonal adjustment quirks. So I think you really need to we got to wait. We got to see what the December number is. And I think that's going to give the Fed a little bit more clarity. But going forward, I think they do have to look a little bit further ahead than just 1 month of employment or inflation because, monetary policy acts with a long and very variable lag. And a lot of the weakness in the labor market over the last few months you can chalk up to the federal shutdown, the buyouts for federal workers, but also the tightening in financial market conditions and the surge in policy uncertainty that happened in April. That takes several months before it shows up in the economy and the labor market. And that was what was hitting the labor market over the last few months. And that's fading and that's going to flip. And hopefully the job market, begins to improve in early next year.
Well, as you have said recently, it seems to be the kind of something in there for everybody. If you're a dove, if you're a hawk. Uh, in terms of the Psalm rule,
Yeah.
because we haven't heard much about it for a while, but there were a few months back, it's all anybody was talking about. Oh, the Psalm rule, when it does XYZ, it's showing that the economy is going to head into recession. First of all, remember, the first part of that question would be, do you put anything on that rule right now? And whether you do or you don't, if we look at the negative side, for the more dovish members of the FOMC, what is unemployment telling us right now?
Yeah, I think the sound rule is a fantastic rule. It's a good guidepost, but it's just that. I mean, it's not set in concrete. I mean, if you go back to last summer, the sound rule, barely got triggered, but it got triggered, and there was a lot of concerns about a recession. But when you peel back the layers of the onion and see why the unemployment rate is going up last summer, it was because of new entrants, re-entrants in the labor force. And again, that's a lot less threatening to the economy than if the unemployment rate is going up because of people losing their jobs. So unemployment is rising. We have a very similar situation now. I mean, there's more of an increase in permanent and temporary unemployed, but still, there's still a good number of reentrants that are putting some upward pressure on the unemployment rate. So even though the SOM rule, is starting to flash yellow to red, I don't think this is, the final nail in the coffin of this expansion. I think we're in barreling towards a recession or near a recession in early next year. But I do worry about the so-called jobless expansion. I think that's going to be more characteristic of the economy in 26 than a recession.
Jobless expansion. What exactly do you mean by that?
Yeah, I think we're gonna have this disconnect next year because currently, I mean, we still have a very fragmented economy, and that's going to be the case in 2026. But you know, so really, your perceptions of the economy, the labor market depend on who you ask. If you're employed, the labor market's fine. If you're unfortunately unemployed or not in the labor force looking to find work, it's a very challenging but not impossible labor market. Next year, though, I worry that you're going to see GDP growth 2.5%. A lot of the heavy lifting is going to come from AI. Consumer spending is going to be solid. We're going to get solid or decent productivity gains, but we're not going to create a lot of jobs. And that comes from the so-called break-even estimates. It's the economist's fancy word of saying essentially how many jobs we've got to create every single month to keep the unemployment rate stable. And that's a
Right.
function of labor supply, the participation rate, and a couple other things. But with less immigration, we know the participation rate's coming down because unfortunately we're getting older as a workforce. 10, 11,000 people are retiring every single day. So when you kind of do the calculation, the number of jobs you need to create to keep the unemployment rate below 4.5% is probably 30, 40,000 next year, which is a
Yeah.
very low bar.
And this is what's so interesting because again, I want to emphasize a couple of points you just made that when the labor force participation rate rises, frequently the idea is, oh, people are coming back into the labor market. They're looking for jobs again because they're more optimistic. Maybe their neighbor got a job, whatever they're seeing, maybe they're desperate. We don't know, but there's more people coming in. It's not the same as the unemployment rate rising because of weakness necessarily. And it seems to me that you are putting a fair amount of emphasis on this again to show people that hey, it's a different economy now, right?
Yeah.
If you don't have the migrants coming in, if you've had the deportations, if some I was reading an article recently about how 40-year-olds are going back to school because they feel they need different skills now, especially with AI becoming such a big deal in the economy. Um, how do you think the Fed's putting enough emphasis on that? Do you think that's part of the divide then between the the hawkish members on the Fed who dissented against cut, or at least would have dissented if they had the chance, versus those who are saying, oh, labor market's weak, we got to cut rates. I mean, is rate cuts going to do anything for that?
Yeah, and I think this is sort of the dilemma the Fed's facing next year with this so-called jobless or job light expansion is monetary policy really going to be able to solve those problems if it's more a labor supply issue? And the answer is most likely no. The Fed adjusting interest rates isn't going to affect the supply side of the labor market. Uh, I think the Fed's full of very, very smart people, and I'm sure they're dissecting the labor market all different ways, and they're digging into all the numbers. Uh, but I do think I get a sense that there's just too much emphasis on the unemployment rate. And the unemployment rate, I have a love-hate relationship with it. Again, we got to understand why it's rising or why it's falling to whether or no it's not, there's no golden statistic in economics. And unfortunately, I think the unemployment rate is more often viewed as maybe that closest to the golden statistic. That's going to tell you what's going on. I'm more of the prime age employment to population fan. So that's 25 to 54. And that cohort accounts for the lion's share of consumption. Probably using the consumer expenditure survey off the top of my head, it's probably 55, 60% of total consumption. And those are the ones that have to be engaged in the labor market. And that prime age employment to population ratio in November was 80.6. And that
Okay.
kind of line in the sand between an economy that's at or near full employment is 80%, at least historically. So we're still above that. And I think that's more a better barometer, of the overall health of the labor market. So in other words, if you had to put me on an island and say, I can only give you one number and you got to tell me if the job market's good or bad, I would ask for prime age employment to population ratio.
Well, you certainly moving up the top of my list. Thank you very much. Let's look at something that's kind of easier. Wages. Okay.
Yeah.
Average hourly earnings. Um, up 0.3% for the series that excludes supervisory workers in this 2-month report, and up 3.9% over 12 months. And of course, the non-supervisory workers, I mean, that means the bulk of the working population. Uh, what does that tell you? If wages are rising pretty decently, what does that tell us about the labor market?
But that, I mean, the job market has developed some slack, but it's not, beginning to fall apart by any stretch of the imagination. Uh, I think the wage numbers tell me that the labor market's essentially neutral for overall inflation picture. So, nominal wages can grow 3.5%, 4% without generating inflation, and that's just a sum of trend productivity growth in the U.S., which is 1.8%, but that's it's rounded to two. If you throw in the Fed's target of 2% inflation, that kind of gives you your limit, 4%. So, in fact, nominal wages can grow 4% and not essentially generate a lot of inflationary pressures because of the productivity gain. So, I think wages are exactly where the Fed would want them to be. That's going to, be helpful on the non-housing services front because that piece of the inflation puzzle is very sensitive to the health of the labor market and, of course, wages. So, as long as wages don't show signs of, reaccelerating, then the Fed can be, cautiously optimistic that this services disinflation that we've seen recently is going to continue over the next several months.
So I want another thing, not really not so nerdy, but I think a lot of economists who really tear the economy apart like you do, total hours worked, okay? Up 0.3 month over month in November, rising at an annual rate of 1.7% over the 3 months, even though they were flat in October. Um, is this rise in the demand for labor services a counterpoint to a gain in what we saw in the unemployment rate, where you've already
Yep.
given us some good reasons why we shouldn't put too much emphasis on unemployment?
Yeah, I wouldn't put too much emphasis on it now. Let's see what happens in December and in January. I mean, if it continues to rise, then I'm going to sound more concerned. I mean, I'm always concerned as an economist, always concerned about the labor market. That's your firewall between an
Mhm.
economy that is chugging along or slowing and a recession. But I think it is encouraging that you saw the work week as well increase. And typically, businesses cut hours before workers, and the fact that they're raising hours worked is, I think, another tentative sign that the labor market's finding its footing, it's stabilizing, and that a lot of these drags that or issues that hit the labor market earlier this year around Liberation Day, around tariffs, is beginning to fade. And we should start to see better jobs numbers early next year. I mean, we got to keep our expectations in check. I mean, the days of 200, 300,000 jobs per month, I think those days are over. But if we get 50, 30, 40, 50,000 jobs per month, I think it's a good jobs number. But it is encouraging that hours are, beginning to show signs of creeping higher.
You kind of can't say that enough. That look, you guys, they're just not going to have the at this point in the economy with so many factors. We're because it's not that long ago we were used to 150,000. Oh my God, payroll slowed down to 130,000. Oh, thank goodness they went back up to 175, right? So these new numbers and this new way of thinking about payrolls and what you can expect is so important. Do you
Yeah,
see a
the
difference?
expectations are
Oh,
really important. I mean, we can't use the last couple of years, and sometimes economists have a bad track record and or a bad habit of assuming what happened in the past is going to happen in the immediate future, and that's more often not the case. Particularly when you get big shifts in immigration. In a normal year, it's 1.1 million net immigration into the U.S. This year, we're looking at, based on our tracking estimate, about 300,000. That's an enormous delta, and that's putting a lot of pressure on labor supply because foreign-born workers generally have a higher participation rate than native-born workers. So again, this labor supply, labor demand debate is not going to fade anytime soon. But that is one reason why we got to lower our expectations for job growth next year.
AI. Everybody talks about AI, right? And how much of a factor is it in the labor market at this point? It's still so new. You can see varying reports on, oh, AI is it's going to make it, you got to have AI, you got to use it, everyone's using it. And then you'll see figures on adoption. And some trends show the adoption rate slowing, right? So
Right.
we're still waiting to see. But what do you see there in particular, what it means for the labor market now? Do you see this as part of the impact here? And what do you see it doing down the road?
Well, I think the immediate impact, what we're seeing today, it's very difficult to come to any concrete conclusion, but generally the takeaway looking at employment across occupations broken down by highly exposed to AI versus not or less exposed to AI. it doesn't show any meaningful impact that, the highly exposed AI jobs are rolling over and falling precipitously. That's just not the case. I think we're still in the early innings of this, just exactly to your point, that it's so new. Businesses are seeing how it works or fits into their workflow. Businesses know the job market is still relatively tight because even, let's take the unemployment rate at face value at 4.6, that's still historically a pretty low unemployment rate. So they're not going to lay off workers until they're sure that AI is actually going to, make a difference. Down the road, I think in the end, I mean, our forecast assumes that it's creative destruction, that it's, AI is going to create a lot more jobs in the future than it destroys. Doesn't mean that, between today and to that point, there's going to be, there's not going to be some bumps along the way. But in the end, I think AI is going to create a lot of jobs. I think about my 5-year-old, 8-year-old, and 11-year-old. Odds are they're going to have jobs down the road that don't even exist today because of AI.
Well, I was speaking to someone recently who said that what he's telling young people that work in his financial services firm, that you've got to now even work harder on your personal skills. You can't, coding and sitting at your and being brilliant there is not enough because now AI can take over many things like that. And so it's what you see about them, how you communicate that to people that is going to make a big difference for your three kids when they get
Mhm.
there.
No, I agree. And there's the soft skills. But the good thing is when we look at AI exposed jobs and just, look at the skill sets of the people that are in these occupations, there's a certain subset that you're worried about because their skills aren't easily transferable to other industries or other occupations. Those are the ones you worry about become structurally unemployed, where, in other words, they, are unemployed for a long period of time. Uh, but that's where, job retraining, the government could step in and, kind of
Right.
incentivize people to go back to school, build up their soft skills. And that's why I'm still skeptical of the argument that, the robots or AI are coming for all our jobs. It's just, this has kind of been an argument that's made, every single decade since probably the 1970s, 1980s.
Well, let me quickly interject that I hate it when calling customer service and I can't get a human being. There's too many questions I have. It just doesn't work. But we can talk about that another time because I want to
And the
ask you
trick of hitting zero no longer works.
exactly.
So,
You're forced to do it. And you don't get,
that,
and you can spend an hour and still not get the question to your answer. But so economic growth, what kind of GDP do you think we're going to see and as we head into 2026?
So our baseline is 2.5% GDP growth, real GDP growth, and for that's at the if you look at the consensus range, we're at the tippy top, and there's a couple of reasons, I think behind that. I'm a little bit speculating because you don't know exactly what's embedded in the consensus forecast, but we know AI is going to be, investment's going to be very strong next year, but I do think non-AI related equipment spending is also going to have a pretty good year because fundamentally. Uh, there's plenty of supports there. Corporate bond spreads are very tight. So absent a credit event, spreads are going to remain tight next year. Profit margins are still among the widest on record. And that policy uncertainty, it doesn't have to drop a lot. It just has to level off because U.S. businesses, they're agile. They can adjust. So I think they're getting used to this new environment where tariff rates are going to change from month to month or quarter to quarter. And they're adjusting to that. And I think there's going to be some release of this spending that was equipment spending that was going to occur this year in 2026. And then unfortunately, we're still going to have a K-shaped consumer. High income consumer is going to do the bulk of the lifting. But as long as the job market hangs in there as we expect, with the unemployment rate averaging a little bit less than 4.5 next year, you're going to see GDP growth, 2.5% next year.
Okay, Federal Reserve, what's your forecast? We've got a meeting in January that's, just around the corner. Um, it seems to me that the split in the markets now is more between, oh, they're going to do more likely they're going to do January now, especially after the unemployment rate up, versus others who are saying, we got to wait probably till March or maybe even June before they'll be willing
Yeah.
to do something. So, what do you see at Oxford Economics?
June, that's the next cut. I think the Fed's going to want a period of time to let buy themselves some time to see how the last few rate cuts are impacting the economy because the Fed can kind of argue that they're within the range of roughly neutral. They don't exactly know where neutral is, so they want to progress more slowly. And also, I mean, yes, the unemployment rate moved up, but other parts of the jobs numbers suggest that the labor market's finding its footing. And I think that also should take a little bit of pressure off the Fed to cut in January. And then don't forget, the inflation numbers overall, are going to look better next year, but not earlier in the year because you get the so-called residual seasonality. Inflation has a tendency to perk up in January. That's going to give the Fed a little bit of pause. So I think in the end, they're going to try to sit on their hands for as long as they can. And that means the next cut's probably in June.
Okay, has the Fed given up on 2% inflation? They seem to be pretty okay with 3% above target for 4.5 years. And in fact, in that last meeting, that's a big debate you can see inside the Fed
Yeah.
right now.
Well, I don't think they can say that publicly, but I think uh, their tolerance is beginning to increase. I think if you get something between 2.5 core inflation, which we should get at the end of next year, because if you look at all the housing disinflation that's in the pipeline, if the job market, you get nominal wages around 3.5, 4%, that's not going to be inflationary. You got the tariff effect, hopefully, running its course. So we should start to see, noticeably better inflation numbers. But again, I think, that 2.5% is sort of where the Fed would declare victory if we get core inflation back there on a persistent basis. But they can't say publicly that we've given up. They can't throw up their hands and say, we raised the white flag, because I do think you'll start to see some better inflation numbers over the next 12, 18 months.
Okay, well, let's end on a fairly positive note then. Before I let you go, as I still try to decide what my New Year's resolution is, I could have about 50 of them. What's yours? Do you have one?
Well, my New Year's resolution every year is to narrow the forecast error for the U.S. economy across the board, no matter what variable it is. But also, I think this one I'm going to add on this year. I'll add on just missing fewer baseball games. So I coach all three of the kids' games. I think I missed one last year. So my goal this year is to miss none.
And you have three kids and they all play baseball and
I'll
you
play
coach
baseball.
every team.
I do.
That's one of your big loves though, baseball.
It is. It's a love of mine. I mean, not to go down rabbit holes, but that's how I got into economics. Is I had a professor in undergrad tie the labor market in with baseball. And I'm sure you're well aware, but former Fed Chair Ben Bernanke wrote a lot about the economics of baseball and tied it in with productivity. And that was just music to my ears, and I got hooked.
Wow. Oh, well, Ryan, thank you so very much. Love everything you had to say about the economy, unemployment, the Fed, and I love you tying baseball to your kids and New Year's. And Ben Bernanke, what better way to end the interview?
Exactly. Thank you so much
Oh,
for having me.
okay. Ryan Sweet is Chief Global Economist and Managing Director at Oxford Economics. I'm Kathleen Hays. This is Central Bank Central, and thank you for joining us.